Chapter 66. Shinjia had no choice but to stop talking about it. But after class, she still brought it up with Pei Chi again. At this time, the school's forum had gone crazy. The campus belle, Pei Chi, was the mistress of a rich man. The most ridiculous rumor was that the man who kept Pei Chi was a 70-year-old man. In less than half a day, Pei Chi was almost drowned in the rumors. At noon, Pei Huan found Pei Chi and stood at the door, exasperated. "Pei Chi, come out." Pei Chi walked out slowly. Pei Huan's face was a little pale. She raised her hand and slapped Pei Chi's face. Pei Chi turned her face away, and 5 red marks appeared on her fair face. She turned her head slowly. Pei Huan looked at her coldly. "You're so shameless." Before she could finish, Pei Chi slapped back, and half of Pei Huan's face was swollen. Pei Huan covered her face and looked at Pei Chi in disbelief. "You dare to hit me? Why not?" Pei Chi didn't care whether her face was hurt or not. She looked at Pei Huan coldly. "You're the shameless one, and your mother. Isn't that right?" Pei Huan sneered. "Pei Chi, you've probably forgotten who you are. You're just an illegitimate child, a dog raised by the Pei family." As soon as she finished speaking, Pei Chi pounced on her. In the end, they were called to the principal's office together. Because they were relatives, it was difficult for the school to deal with them. Pei Huan's face was a mess, her arm was bitten, and her neck was scratched by Pei Chi. Pei Huan couldn't stand it, and she kept trying to sue Pei Chi. The principal was also having a headache. Coupled with the news that had appeared on the school's website this morning, he looked at Pei Chi. "Call your parents over." Pei Huan glared at Pei Chi. "I'm telling you, my mother came for me. As for my father, I won't let him know. You'd better be smart." Her words made Pei Chi even more certain that it wasn't Pei Huan who spread the news. The principal looked at Pei Chi with a complicated gaze. He had always liked this girl. She was obedient and good at her studies. She was also one of the top 3 students in the entire grade, but now, many girls lost themselves very quickly. For money, selling their bodies was not a new thing. He had to have a good talk with her parents. "Pei Chi, you should call your parents over too. This matter has to be dealt with eventually." Actually, the fight wasn't that serious. However, the fact that Pei Chi was a mistress had to be clarified in order to maintain the school's image. Pei Chi bit her lip and walked out of the principal's office. The school's attitude was very clear just now. If she couldn't explain this matter, she might be expelled from the school. "Are you afraid now?" Pei Huan stood at the door. Her clothes were a little tattered as she stared at her. Pei Chi looked at her and said coldly, "Pei Huan, you're the dumbest person I've ever met." Pei Huan was about to explode again. She wanted to pounce on her again. Pei Chi walked away. She walked to an empty corner and took a deep breath while looking out of the window. She probably already knew who had framed her. She laughed softly, and it was a little bitter. No matter who it was, it shouldn't be her. She would rather it be Pei Huan. She put her finger in her pocket and took out her cell phone. It was a gift from Tang Yu. Chapter 67. The phone rang 3 or 4 times before Tang Yu picked it up. Chi. His voice was elegant and pleasant, and there was a tinge of confusion in it because she had never taken the initiative to call him. Pei Chi pursed her lips. "Can you come to school?" "What's wrong?" Tang Yu's voice wasn't as calm as before. Pei Chi said with great difficulty, "I got into a fight with someone and injured him." "I see." He actually chuckled. "So you won." She nodded and thought to herself, "That's not the point, okay?" But she didn't say that she had hit Pei Huan. Tang Yu pondered for a moment. I'll be there in half an hour. Is that okay? If it wasn't okay, she would probably have to take a helicopter. Pei Chi was a little flattered. She thought that even if he could come, he would have to finish his work first. She stammered, but, yes. Tang Yu had already stood up and was walking out with his jacket. Xiao Ran happened to bring a document over. President, this is an urgent letter from New York. We'll talk about it when I come back in the afternoon. Tang Yu didn't stop and stepped into the elevator. When he turned around, he saw Xiao Ran's stunned expression. When Tang Yu arrived at the principal's office, the principal couldn't stay calm anymore. Didn't he say to call for her parents? Why did he call for her boyfriend? What's more, he was a successful and powerful boyfriend. Tang Yu introduced himself as such. Principal Wang, I'm Chi-Chi's boyfriend. Principal Wang was stunned for a moment before he stood up, wiped his hands, and clenched his fists. Pei Chi-Chi was also stunned by the sight. She didn't ask him to do that. Of course, Zhou Meilin and Pei Huan were also stunned. Tang Yu actually said that Pei Chi-Chi was his girlfriend. Was this wretched girl trying to go to heaven? Tang Yu said calmly, but his tone was dignified. I heard that your school condoned the campus network to slander Pei Chi-Chi. I will get my lawyers to follow up on this matter. Headmaster Wang's forehead was already sweating. What the fuck? Now that Mr. Tang had spoken, no one dared to say anything, even if she was really a virgin. It's a misunderstanding. Principal Wang took out a handkerchief and leaned forward to wipe his sweat. He thought for a moment, then added, regarding this matter, I will find the person who first spread the word about Remote Maker and harshly criticize him. Tang Yu snorted. I want results in 24 hours. Of course, we will definitely deal with it as soon as possible. Principal Wang said very respectfully and then sent Tang Yu to the door. When Tang Yu reached the door, he turned his head and said, I remember there's a library in B University that needs donations. Mr. Tang, you mean? Tang Yu said calmly. I will donate it in the name of Pei Chi-Chi. I will donate it in the name of Pei Chi-Chi. Tang Yu said calmly. Principal Wang was stunned. Then, he looked at Chi-Chi. At this moment, he was no longer a problem student, but a super big South African diamond. Yes. Student pay is still very outstanding. The department and the school have been considering student pay's recommendation to study abroad. After he said that, he felt that it was inappropriate. It was so far away. What if Mr. Tang was reluctant? Tang Yu said, that's not bad. As he said that, Pei Chi-Chi looked up at him. Did he really want her to study abroad? Chapter 68. Zhou Meilin and Pei Huan followed them out. Mr. Tang, it wasn't Pei Huan who said it. Zhou Meilin felt guilty, but she was also a little afraid of Tang Yu. She was also unreconciled. Look at how Pei Chi-Chi beat Pei Huan up. Tang Yu's gaze fell on Pei Huan's face. Indeed, she was scratched a little. He turned his head again and looked at Pei Chi-Chi's face. There were only 5 finger marks. It must have been Pei Huan who started it. He sighed in his heart. If he angered her one day, would she treat him as fiercely as she did now? Zhou Meilin looked at Tang Yu's unmoved expression. She was a little anxious, so she said calmly, no matter what, Pei Huan is Jinrong's fiancé, and Pei Chi-Chi was just Tang Yu's mistress. What about Jinrong? Why didn't he see such a big thing happened? Tang Yu chuckled and then looked at Zhou Meilin and Pei Huan. Whether it was you or not, I'll put all the blame on you for anything related to Chi-Chi in school. Pei Huan's face turned pale. Tang Yu's meaning was very obvious. If something happened to Pei Chi-Chi, she had to take responsibility for it. She wanted to say something but was stopped by Zhou Meilin. Zhou Meilin's voice had a hint of flattery. Of course. Huan Huan and Chi Chi are sisters. Of course, they have to help each other. Pei Chi Chi almost vomited when she heard that. Tang Yu was also not interested in watching Zhou Meilin's acting. He held Pei Chi Chi's hand and looked at her sideways. Have you eaten? She shook her head absent-mindedly. Only then did she feel that she was really hungry. Tang Yu smiled and led her out of school. Pei Chi Chi followed him. Where are we going? I have classes in the afternoon. Let's eat. But, did he need to hold her hand all the time? Pei Chi Chi lowered her head to look at his hand that was holding hers. She struggled slightly, and Tang Yu tightened his grip on her hand. His voice was neither cold nor warm. Pei Chi Chi, I haven't settled the score for the fight at school. Oh. She behaved herself and followed him out of the house. The sunlight outside was so bright that their shadows seemed to stretch for a long time. A handsome figure stood behind 2 rows of Chinese parasol trees. He stared at Tang Yu and Pei Chi Chi from afar. His gaze was a little distant. Outside the school gate, Tang Yu's black Jaguar was parked, but it was surrounded by reporters, big and small, long and short cameras and cannons aimed at the school gate. Pei Chi Chi subconsciously hid behind Tang Yu, not wanting to be photographed. No matter how noble Tang Yu was, it was not a glorious thing to be his mistress. But he pulled her body out and said in a low voice, "What are you afraid of?" Pei Chi Chi looked up at him. Tang Yu cupped her little face and kissed her forehead before looking at her. Chi Chi, I don't have a girlfriend and I'm not engaged. It's normal for us to be together. No one could say anything unless she felt guilty. And now, Tang Yu did not see her as a woman he had bought. It seemed that other than her physical needs, there were other things. For example, she knew how to make chicken noodles, or she was stupid. Her gaze was a little dazed. He lowered his head and kissed her little mouth again, his voice almost hoarse. Are you ready? Ready? Ready for what? Pei Chi Chi was stunned for a moment before he put his arm around her little shoulders and walked towards his car. Chapter 69. Tang Yu looked up. It's a relationship between a man and a woman. This answer was a little vague, however, the reporters weren't that easy to deal with. They followed them frantically and even got into the car. Tang Yu and Pei Chi Chi were stuck there. Mr. Tang, will you and Miss Pei Chi Chi get married before she graduates? Mr. Tang, what if Miss Pei Chi Chi gets pregnant? All the questions revolved around Pei Chi Chi's belly. Tang Yu looked around and said calmly, my relationship with Chi Chi is very simple. I won't touch her before she graduates. Pei Chi Chi had already received all kinds of shocks and changes today, but she was most speechless at this moment. He said that he wouldn't touch her before graduation. Then who was the man who had been holding her in all kinds of positions these past few nights? However, Tang Yu was like a piece of jade, and the words he said were very convincing. Even Pei Chi Chi herself doubted that. She was still a fucking virgin. Just then, the school finally sent security to protect Tang Yu and Pei Chi Chi as they got into the car. The car drove further and further away. In the school, Pei Huan stood in front of Lin Jinrong. She asked softly, you called the reporters, didn't you? She knew what he was thinking too well. He was doing this for Pei Chi Chi. He was forcing Tang Yu to admit Pei Chi Chi's identity. Lin Jinrong retracted his gaze and looked at Pei Huan quietly. You know how we slept together, don't you? With that, he turned and left. The sunlight shone through his back, bathing him in the sunlight. However, Pei Huan felt that he was on the dark side of his entire being. Jinrong. Pei Huan called him softly. Lin Jinrong didn't stop and continued walking forward. Tang Yu brought Pei Chi Chi to a private restaurant for dinner. The restaurant wasn't big, but it was exquisite. Aren't you in a hurry to go back to the company? Pei Chi Chi asked in a low voice. Tang Yu was also a little hungry, so he ate quickly and elegantly. When he heard her words, he looked up and said, "I have a lunch break at noon." She said, "Oh," and lowered her head to eat. After a while, she looked up again. "Then if someone asks, how am I going to explain? No need to explain." Tang Yu smiled and reached out to rub her hair. He didn't need to report to anyone who he was with. Today, it was only because Pei Chi-Chi was attacked for no reason. Pei Chi-Chi lowered her head and finished the rice. He smiled when he saw that there was not a single grain of rice left in her bowl. When he sent Pei Chi-Chi to school, there were many students gathered at the school gate. There were two major events that had happened to Pei Chi-Chi today. First, Pei Chi-Chi's sugar daddy had appeared, and he was extraordinarily handsome. If all the sugar daddies were so handsome and rich, please give them a dozen of them. Second, Pei Chi-Chi had beaten up Pei Huan. It was a battle between the campus belle and the department belle, and the campus belle won in terms of physical strength and explosive power. Pei Chi-Chi got out of the car and bent down to say goodbye to Tang Yu. He called out to her, "Chi-Chi." She bent down to look at him. Tang Yu leaned over and kissed her on the lips. He said in a low voice, "Go earlier in the afternoon." Her face was burning as she looked at him and nodded. Tang Yu smiled and started the car. In the crowd, Chen Xinjie stood there and waved at Pei Chi-Chi. "Chi-Chi." Pei Chi-Chi walked over and smiled. "It's all settled." Chapter 70. Pei Chi-Chi smiled and walked into the classroom with her. She went to Xing Yuan in the afternoon. To her surprise, Tang Yu transferred her to the design department and arranged a desk and chair for her. Pei Chi-Chi sat with her fingers gently touching the desk and chair. She knew how lucky it was for a student who didn't graduate to be able to enter the design department of Xing Yuan. She felt a little complicated. She knew that this was an exception for Tang Yu. She knew that he wasn't a person who couldn't distinguish between work and work, but he still made an exception for her. At 5:00 in the afternoon, Tang Yu called her and asked her to go back first. He still had a meeting to host. In the end, he added calmly, "Take a taxi back. Otherwise, I'll get Qingqing to send you." Of course, Pei Chi-Chi didn't want to trouble Meng Qingqing, so she obediently took a taxi back. Tang Yu sat in the office and looked at the phone in his hand. After a while, he smiled and put down the phone. Today, the matter between him and Pei Chi-Chi was in the newspaper. So be it. He didn't stop it and there was no PR. However, there might be some trouble. At this moment, in the Yanhui Villa area, Tang Ziyuan was talking to Lin Yun on the phone. His tone was full of dissatisfaction. "Lin Yun, aren't you too indulgent with Tang Yu? Look at today's newspaper. Who is he entangled with? Pei Mingyi's daughter. Not to mention that she's from a small family, she's also an illegitimate daughter. How can the Tang family face others if this gets out?" On the other side, Lin Yun was wearing an elegant cheongsam. She held the phone in her hand and smiled lightly. The news has already spread. Moreover, Tang Ziyuan, you don't seem to have a very noble background. You can't even be considered a small family. Lin Yun had never been courteous with Tang Ziyuan. Tang Ziyuan almost jumped up. His ex-wife had poked his sore spot, however, he quickly recovered. "Tell him to break up with that girl immediately. Tang Yu is an adult." Lin Yun couldn't help but say coldly. "Moreover, he's unmarried. He can be with whoever he wants." Tang Ziyuan was stunned. He was a little annoyed by his ex-wife, but he still didn't dare to lose his temper. In this life, Tang Ziyuan only lacked confidence in front of two people. One was Lin Yun, and the other was his old master, Lin Yu. At this moment, he was silent for a moment before saying, "Yun Yun, can't we be more rational and only talk about Tang Yu? Call me Lin Yun or Ms. Lin, Mr. Tang Ziyuan. Lin Yun's voice was cold. Besides, we have nothing to talk about. With that, he hung up the phone. On the other side, Tang Ziyuan looked at the phone and felt melancholy. It wasn't that he didn't have feelings for Yin Yun, it was just that he had lost himself. Lin Yun was also extremely beautiful when she was young, but she wasn't as charming as Zhao Ku. He just made a mistake that all men would make. On one side, Tang Ziyuan was reminiscing about the past. On the other side, Zhao Ku held the newspaper and stared at the photo on it. It was her. Her slender fingers clenched tightly, and her exquisite fingernails suddenly shrank, almost cutting through the newspaper. Zhao Ku's face was filled with terror. No, she absolutely couldn't let that child destroy her happiness. She couldn't. Tang Ziyuan, who was immersed in the past, didn't notice her strange behavior. Pei Qiqi's life was peaceful. She went to school, worked, and would visit Pei Mingyi on the weekends. Sometimes, Zhou Meilin and Pei Huan would also be home. They would look at her with disdain, but Pei Qiqi didn't care. Chapter 71. Qiqi, I feel like I've been blessed by God recently. The company's performance is improving day by day. Pei Mingyi's expression was one of extreme satisfaction. I can't believe that a flower has bloomed in my old age. Zhou Meilin sat far away and said sourly, it's all because of Jinrong's family. Otherwise, do you really think you can make a comeback? Pei Mingyi smiled awkwardly. Part of it, part of it. Dad is the best in my heart. Pei Qiqi said softly, greatly comforting Pei Mingyi. He smiled with infinite satisfaction. Zhou Meilin heard it. Just comfort yourself. How can you say such rude words in front of a child? Pei Mingyi couldn't help but scold her. Zhou Meilin was usually arrogant, but was it appropriate to say such words in front of a child? Zhou Meilin smiled strangely. Qiqi is not a child anymore. Pei Qiqi understood what she meant, so she smiled. Yes, Dad. Pei Huan and I have grown up. Zhou Meilin's nose was crooked. This bitch had a sharp tongue. She didn't try to show off anymore. She and Pei Huan now understood that Tang Yu was now Pei Qiqi's backer. There was no benefit in offending her. However, she wanted to see how long this flower, Pei Qiqi, could bloom on Tang Yu's bedside. Pei Qiqi didn't stay for dinner, even though Pei Mingyi wanted her to. At 4:00 in the afternoon, Pei Qiqi didn't immediately return to Xia City after leaving. Instead, she went to the city library to borrow 2 books. When she came out, the heat wave brought by the bright sun rushed in. Her whole body seemed to be washed by the heat. Pei Qiqi held a small bag to block the sun as she slowly walked to the bus stop. A black limousine slowly stopped beside her. Pei Qiqi took a step back. The window rolled down. An extremely beautiful lady was sitting in the driver's seat. She wore a pair of Chanel sunglasses on her exquisite nose. Her beautiful red lips opened slightly. Miss Pei, I am Tang Yu's mother. I want to talk to you. Pei Qiqi looked at her, but she couldn't see into her eyes. The woman in the car said that she was Tang Yu's mother and that she had met Lin Yun before. I'm sorry, I don't know you. Pei Qiqi took another step back and walked toward the bus stop. In the car, Zhao Ku took off her sunglasses. Wait a minute. Pei Qiqi subconsciously turned around and was stunned. That woman was very similar to her. She had seen the photos that Pei Mingyi had secretly hidden. They were exactly the same. The blood in her body seemed to be surging, but it also seemed to be completely frozen. She couldn't move her body at all. Zhao Ku's voice softened a little, not as arrogant as before. Get in the car. This is not the place to talk. Pei Qiqi pursed her lips into a straight line. and there was no color on her lips. After a long time, she finally opened the back door of the car and sat inside. Zhao Ku put on her sunglasses and turned the car around. 10 minutes later, Zhao Ku brought Pei Chi to a very secluded coffee shop, the kind with a small private room. Pei Chi sat opposite Zhao Ku. She stared at Zhao Ku in front of her. Zhao Ku looked very elegant. Her Chanel suit made her look even more beautiful. Her face was exquisitely made up, and her hair was tied up. She looked like a rich lady. 2 cups of mo Thai, Zhao Ku said softly to the waiter, then looked at Pei Chi. You're not picky, right? Pei Chi shook her head slowly. In fact, she didn't drink coffee. Chapter 72. Zhao Ku looked at Pei Chi, and Pei Chi noticed that Zhao Ku didn't want to look at her. She just glanced at her for a moment, and then immediately lowered her head to stir the coffee in the cup. Zhao Ku picked up the cup gracefully and took a sip. She looked up and saw that Pei Chi didn't move. She smiled faintly and said, "These are coffee beans imported from Holland. You can't get them in a regular coffee shop." Pei Chi pushed the cup forward and looked straight at Zhao Ku. "I don't like coffee." So, no matter how good the coffee beans were, they were not attractive. Zhao Ku's eyes showed a hint of displeasure, but she hid it well. She put down the cup, wiped her lower lip with a tissue, and took out her lipstick to touch up her makeup. Then she said unhurriedly, "Tell me, how much do you want?" Pei Chi looked at her, her eyes a little hot. This woman, who looked very similar to her, appeared in front of her not to look at her, but to ask her to leave Tang Yu. Pei Chi's little face was expressionless as she stared into Zhao Ku's eyes. Slowly, she said, "You married Tang Yu's father, right?" There was a trace of anger in Zhao Ku's eyes, as well as a trace of discomfiture, as if she had been seen through. "No matter what, I'm Tang Yu's mother now. I don't want you to pester him. Tell me, how much do you want to leave him?" Zhao Ku said as she took out a slender cigarette from her handbag, lit it, and took a puff. Even the way she smoked was very beautiful. She used to be the most beautiful woman in B City. Pei Chi couldn't remember how long it had been since she last blinked. Her whole body was a little numb. 1 billion, and I'll leave him. "Mrs. Tang, is that okay?" Pei Chi's voice was very soft, but in Zhao Ku's ears, it was extremely sarcastic. 1 billion. Even after she married Tang Ziyuan and suffered for so many years, Tang Ziyuan still didn't give her 1 billion. She stubbed out the cigarette in annoyance and looked at Pei Chi. "That's too much. 10 million. If you agree, I'll write you a check immediately." Pei Chi didn't move. She looked into Zhao Ku's eyes and asked, "Are you my mother?" Zhao Ku had already stretched out her hand to take the check, but after hearing what Pei Chi said, she froze. She slowly raised her eyes and looked at Pei Chi as if she had seen a ghost. She wanted to take out another cigarette, but found that the pack was empty. Suddenly, she said in a shrill voice, "I'm not your mother. I don't know you. I never knew you." With trembling hands, Zhao Ku grabbed the bag on the table and almost stumbled out. The sound of high heels hammered into Pei Chi's heart. It was very painful, like a nail being hammered into his heart. The chair that she had been sitting on was slanted across the room. Zhao Ku accidentally dropped a paper bag on the table. Pei Chi picked it up and a name card fell out. It was a director of a club, and the name on it was Zhao Ku. Zhao Ku, Pei Chi repeated the name over and over again. Pei Mingyi always told her that her mother loved her very much and that her mother passed away after giving birth to her, but now she saw that her mother's name was Zhao Ku. She was Tang Yu's stepmother. She married someone else and had a man other than Pei Mingyi. She didn't love her at all. She didn't even dare to look at her. Chapter 73. Pei Chi thought that she would not care about the word mother in this life, but when Zhao Ku appeared in front of her, she still could not control herself. It turned out that she also longed for love. But now, her heart felt as if it had been drenched by a heavy downpour. He was thoroughly and thoroughly dead. She did not know how long she had been sitting there. The waiter came twice, but when he saw her like this, he secretly left. It was not until the sky turned dark that Pei Chi walked out shakily. In the sky, there was a light drizzle. Under the streetlights, the raindrops were as dense as fine needles. She raised her head and looked at the sky, letting the light rain fall on her face. She walked aimlessly, ignoring the abrasion on her feet. Blood seeped out along with the rainwater, leaving streaks of dark red blood. The rain became heavier and heavier, like beans falling from the sky. The sky was completely gray, and even the lights at night could not illuminate it. Finally, she squatted down and hugged her knees with her arms, her body shivering. Zhou Meilin's words kept replaying in her mind. Pei Chi, you are the same as that bitch mother of yours. Pei Chi smiled absent-mindedly. It would be great if they were the same, then she would not be in pain. It turned out that the woman who gave birth to her had never loved her. Now, she came to look for her because she was afraid that she would destroy her happiness. Pei Chi's whole body was ice cold. She hugged herself tightly, but she could not feel any warmth. She heard her phone ringing non-stop, but she did not want to pick it up. After a long time, the phone went silent. Her face was on her knees, and her eyes were open. Her clothes had long been soaked by the rain. A black sports car came to a screeching halt beside her, and the person in the car opened the door and jumped out. He did not hold an umbrella, and walked quickly towards her. Tang Yu stretched out his hand to lift Pei Chi's little face, and saw that there was not a single trace of blood on her pale little face. He stretched out his hand and patted her cheek. Pei Chi, she did not respond, so he patted her twice hard, with enough force to turn her face black. This time, she woke up. Her face was wet, and so were her trembling eyelashes. She looked at him, her lips trembling, and for a long time she could not speak. Tang Yu's eyes darkened. He carried her to the back seat of the car, turned on the heater, and quickly took off her clothes, all of them. He sat down and placed Pei Chi's body in his arms. He pulled a towel and carefully dried her body. When he did all of this, Pei Chi did not resist. It was as if she had lost consciousness, allowing him to do all of this, but her eyes were empty. Tang Yu didn't ask. He reached out and began to unbutton his shirt, one button at a time. After taking it off, he put it on her and buttoned it up. His voice was a little hoarse. I'll take you to the hospital. Damn it. Her body was very cold just now, but now it was abnormally hot. The person in his arms struggled violently, but in the end, she had no strength and went limp in his arms. Pei Chi's eyes finally met his, and her voice was hoarse. I don't want. Tang Yu stared at her for 2 seconds, and then he reached for his phone and dialed Meng Qingqing's number. Call the director of Xingyuan Hospital to Xia City immediately. Chapter 74. Meng Qingqing immediately contacted the unlucky dean. When the dean heard that it was Tang Yu, he scrambled to Xia City. Tang Yu took the blanket and covered Pei Chi with it. He patted her little head and stepped into the driver's seat. At this moment, his upper body was bare. Pei Chi was wearing his shirt, wrapped in the blanket, and curled up in the back seat. After what felt like a century, he parked the car steadily in front of the apartment in Xia City. He carried her upstairs carefully and went straight to the bathroom. He filled the bathtub with warm water. Pei Chi seemed to have realized something. She wanted to break free, but he hugged her tightly. His voice was hoarse and stern. Listen to me. Pei Chi quietened down. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Tang Yu peeled off the blanket on her and threw it aside. Then, he moved on to the shirt. When his fingers landed on the button, Pei Chi-Chi's body trembled uncontrollably. Her voice was broken. I'll do it myself. However, he seemed to be angry. He firmly pulled on her button and hugged her back with one hand. Her back was boiling hot. Tang Yu's expression became more and more unpleasant. He held her with one hand and unbuckled his belt with the other. He sat in the warm water and helped her to sit in his arms. Soaking in the warm water was very comfortable. Pei Chi-Chi was uneasy at first, but she gradually calmed down and lay quietly in his arms. She was like a homeless little animal. Tang Yu lowered his head to look at her. He swallowed the questions he wanted to ask. She lay very quietly in his arms. She didn't say a word. Her little fingers were on his shoulder. Her face was tilted in his arms. Her breath was right on his sensitive spot. Tang Yu's body couldn't help but throb. His big palm pressed on her waist, however, that was all he could do. Anything more was impossible. At this moment, the doorbell rang. Pei Chi-Chi looked up and stared at him with her misty eyes. Tang Yu did not have time to put away the love jade in his eyes. He felt a little uncomfortable and coughed lightly. "Time to put on your clothes." He carefully picked her up and put on their bathrobes before opening the door. The director of a certain hospital trembled as he walked in and wiped the rain off his face. "Mr. Tang, where are you feeling unwell?" "Inside." Tang Yu's tone was indifferent. He let them in and walked into the master bedroom. The dean also followed him in and carefully changed his shoes. Pei Chi-Chi was lying on her side with her eyes closed. Her whole body was buried in the pure white blanket, revealing only half of her face. The dean was stunned by Pei Chi-Chi's beauty. She might have a fever after being drenched in the rain. Tang Yu's gaze landed on President He. President He did not dare to look at her anymore. "Let's take her temperature first." Tang Yu was the one who took her temperature. However, the results still surprised him. At this moment, Pei Chi-Chi's temperature was 39 degrees Celsius. "Give her a shot to reduce the fever first. Take the medicine and see if it can go down by tonight. If it doesn't work, we can only get an intravenous drip tomorrow." President He suggested. Tang Yu did not say anything. President He took out a shot to reduce the fever from his medicine box. Tang Yu sat by the bed and rolled up one side of Pei Chi-Chi's sleeve. Her fair arm was exposed, and President He could not bear to do it. At this moment, Pei Chi-Chi opened her eyes and saw the needle. It was thin and sharp. Chapter 75. Tang Yu was stunned for a moment before he realized that she was afraid of injections. And director He was still holding a syringe in his hand. At that moment, he felt like a butcher and that unbelievably beautiful young lady was a kind little rabbit. He didn't know what to do and could only raise the syringe in his hand awkwardly. Tang Yu was a little helpless. He hugged Pei Chi-Chi and coaxed her in a low voice, "You'll get better after an injection." "I don't want an injection," she said incoherently as her little head burrowed into his chest again. Her long hair slipped into his open collar and tickled him. Tang Yu really didn't know that Pei Chi-Chi was so afraid of pain. He patted her back and said in a gentler voice, "Be good, it won't hurt." He didn't see her like this the last time, maybe she was more vulnerable when she was sick. She didn't say anything else. He reached out to push her messy hair aside and looked at her with her eyes closed. She looked like she was in pain. Or like she was asleep. Tang Yu hugged her carefully and signaled to Director He with his eyes. Director He's forehead was sweating. He carefully bent over and gently pricked Pei Chi-Chi's arm. He swore that he was really careful and gentle, but Pei Chi woke up from the pain and moved a little. Director He's voice was softer than the needle. Don't move. He looked at Pei Chi's moving little face and wanted to call her sweetheart. But if he did that, he probably wouldn't be able to be the director anymore. Pei Chi didn't move, but she buried her little face in Tang Yu's arms and cried. At that moment, Tang Yu's heart was unbelievably soft. It was as if he would be Pei Chi's pillar of support for the rest of her life. Director He retracted his supernatural powers and let out a long breath. Mr. Tang, please feed me the medicine later. Once every 8 hours. You'll be fine if the temperature drops. If it still doesn't drop by tomorrow morning, you have to go to the hospital for an injection. He was still worried and reminded him again. Tang Yu nodded. Dean he left on his own, not daring to let anyone send him off. There was still a sweetheart waiting to be coaxed. After he left, Tang Yu's fingers gently stroked the little person in his arms and gently patted her back. After a while, he found that she seemed to have fallen asleep again. Chi. He called her in a low voice. Pei Chi grunted and hugged his waist with her small hands. She snorted. Daddy, Tang Yu was stunned. She called him Daddy. Daddy, Chi is in so much pain. Pei Chi raised her little face and buried it in his neck. Tang Yu was almost scalded. He thought that she must have mistaken him for Pei Mingyi. For some reason, he reached out and patted her, trying to cheer her up. Daddy's here. Be good, I'll go get the medicine. She hugged him tightly and refused to let go. Tang Yu had no choice but to kiss her forehead. Be good, baby. Her little mouth was pressed against his neck, and her voice was a little hoarse and soft. Daddy, can you call me baby again? In front of Zhou Meilin, Pei Mingyi didn't dare to spoil her like this. But now she was so uncomfortable. She wanted her daddy to hug her and call her baby. An indescribable wave surged in Tang Yu's heart. That wave was about to drown him. Chapter 76. He called out to her. After some thought, he realized that there was nothing he could do. She wouldn't let go of him, so he carried her up and went out to get some water and medicine. When he returned to the bedroom, he let her sit in his arms and take the medicine. She felt it was too bitter. Tang Yu had no choice but to keep it in his mouth. He kissed her lips and fed it to her. She wanted to spit it out, but he used a little more force to stop her from moving. Pei Chi was forced to swallow it, but she did not let him feel better. She bit him hard. Not only did she bite him, but she also wrapped herself around him. Her tongue was soft and fragrant. He almost could not control himself. Tang Yu felt that he had never treated anyone this well in his life. Not even Tang Exayan had ever fed him a pill. But when it came to Pei Chi, she was like a mother to him. After taking the medicine, Pei Chi settled down a little and fell asleep on the bed. Tang Yu sat by the bed and put down the glass in his hand. He looked at her for a long time before he stood up. He took his phone and walked out of the room. He called Meng Qingqing. Do you know how to cook? Meng Qingqing was drinking at a bar. When he heard this, he almost spat out the wine. What? Cook? I'm a personal assistant, not a maid. Meng Qingqing took out a cigarette and held it between his fingers. He looked at the little wild cat beside him to stop it from crawling on his body. Tang Yu had already walked to the kitchen. Do you know how to cook or not? His voice sounded colder. Meng Qingqing lowered his head and lit the cigarette. He took a puff. I only know how to cook porridge. Tang Yu frowned. Porridge then. How do you cook it? The cigarette in Meng Qingqing's hand trembled and he almost burned his fingers. Was Tang Yu really going to cook? Was he kidding? You cook. Meng Qingqing finally found his tongue. Tang Yu grunted lightly and took out a pot. Tell me, what do you want to do? Meng Qingqing cursed in his heart. This was the first time he had to ask someone how to cook, and this was the first time he had sex, but he didn't call him to ask him how to do it. However, there were still things that Tang Yu didn't know how to do. Meng Qingqing was lying on the sofa, holding a cigarette between his fingers. He instructed slowly, wash the rice first. Yes, wash it twice. Otherwise, it won't be nutritious. Without any nutrients, after Pei Chi-Chi ate it, it wouldn't feel good in her hands anymore. Meng Qingqing smiled gloomily. The woman beside him had become a decoration. On the other side, Tang Yu, who was a top student, spent half an hour cooking a pot of very good porridge. After turning off the fire, he went back to check on Pei Chi-Chi. She was still asleep. Tang Yu propped his hands on the headboard and called out to her in a low voice, "Chi-Chi, get up and eat something." She woke up a little and buried her little face in the blanket again. She even stretched out her fair and tender little hand and slapped his face. This was the first time that President Tang Yu had been hit by someone, let alone a woman. His face was a little dark as he looked at her little hand that slid down his face. His face was full of black lines, but he didn't argue with her on account that she was a patient. She wrapped the blanket tightly around her, but she was still very cold and her little face was a little pale. Tang Yu bent down again. "Baby." His face was a little hot when he called her that. He wasn't a sentimental person and had never called anyone that before. Pei Chi-Chi's voice was muffled. "It hurts." His entire body was in pain, and he felt very cold. Chapter 77. His heart skipped a beat. After some thought, he slid under the blanket. Just as he lay down, a pair of soft hands wrapped around his waist and her face was buried in his chest. She sighed, probably because it was too comfortable. Her petite body was curled up tightly. Her petite body was tightly embedded in his. Her petite feet were pressed against his and her face was buried in his neck. However, this was not enough. She was still cold. Tang Yu hugged her tightly, placing his large palm on her back and patting her gently. Pei Chi-Chi did not sleep well. Her dreams were very messy. One moment, Zhou Meilin called her a little bitch. The next moment, Pei Mingyi placed her on his shoulder. The scene changed. Zhao Ke's beautiful face appeared in front of her. She was smiling at her and her voice could be heard clearly. "Pei Chi-Chi, I'm not your mother. I don't want you anymore, Mommy." "Mommy." Pei Chi-Chi's hands were clenched tightly. Her head was swaying uncontrollably because of the nightmare. No, her mother was not like that. Pei Mingyi had said that her mother loved her very much. Tears flowed from the corner of her eyes and stained Tang Yu's bathrobe. His heart was warm and wet. It was very uncomfortable, but he felt that he was very close to her. He did not fall asleep and kept watching over her. At this moment, she was crying hard and her body was covered in sweat. He patted her and woke her up. "Chi-Chi, you're dreaming." After much difficulty, she finally calmed down. She looked around, but her eyes were still blank. Tang Yu took the little one out of his arms. "Do you want some porridge?" Pei Chi-Chi looked at him with her eyes wide open. Her eyes looked as though they had been washed by water. They were dark and bright and wet. Her black hair was also wet with sweat as though she had been fished out of the water. After a while, she asked him softly, "What time is it?" Tang Yu grabbed the bedside watch and looked at it. "It's 1:00. Pei Chi-Chi tried to sit up, but she did not have the strength to do so. She slid down again. Only then did he feel his back drenched in sweat. It was extremely uncomfortable. "I want to take a bath," she whispered, biting her lip. Tang Yu smiled. "Sure." He carried her to take a shower. changed into a clean set of pajamas, and carried her back. Pei Chi sat on the bed and looked at his back. "Sorry to trouble you." Her voice was soft, but he still heard it. Tang Yu turned around. "Chi, I've said that we'll be living together during this period of time. Don't overthink it." She looked at him and said nothing, but the light in her eyes was not as bright as before. He quietly watched for a while, then went to the kitchen to heat up the porridge again. After testing that it was not too hot, he scooped a small bowl and brought it to the bedroom. Pei Chi was naturally too embarrassed to let him feed her, so she brought it over herself. However, she did not have a good appetite and could not eat any more after eating half a bowl. Tang Yu didn't force it. He ate a bowl and returned to his bedroom. She was extremely tired and the temperature had dropped, but she was still a little afraid of the cold. She curled up in Tang Yu's arms, but she could not fall asleep. However, Pei Chi did not dare to move, for fear of waking him up. After maintaining this for a long time, Pei Chi finally could not help but want to peek at him to see if he had fallen asleep. However, as soon as she lifted her head, a tragedy happened. The top of her head crashed straight into his chin. With a muffled groan, she hurriedly leaned back. Chapter 78. She took a deep breath and wanted to step back. If it wasn't for a big hand holding her waist, she would have already fallen down. Pei Chi. Tang Yu angrily called her name, but his actions were gentle as he pulled her back and placed her in his arms. Pei Chi didn't dare to look at him. She looked down and said, "I'm sorry. Can't sleep." He rubbed his chin as he looked at her. Pei Chi replied with a Actually, she couldn't sleep, but she didn't dare to. She was afraid to dream of Zhao Ku again. That feeling was too real and too scary. She would rather talk to him, even though she knew how dangerous it was to lie together with a man. But now, to Pei Chi, Tang Yu was like a piece of driftwood. She wanted to hold on to him with all her might. She walked forward carefully and rubbed his chin gently. Tang Yu's eyes were locked on her little face. "What's wrong today?" Pei Chi looked up and lowered her head again. "Nothing." Obviously, she couldn't lie to him. Tang Yu's fingers gently pinched her beautiful little chin and forced her to look up at him. "Pei Chi, why are you out in the rain?" When he saw her, his heart skipped a beat. He was afraid that something had happened to her. His sharp gaze made it impossible for her to hide. Pei Chi wanted to turn her face away, but his fingers pinned her down and forced her to look at him forcefully. "Because of school." She lied. She looked up at him anxiously and lowered her eyelids again. Her eyelids were pink from crying. Her drooping eyelids fluttered, and she looked indescribably lovable. Tang Yu studied her expression carefully. Finally, he let go of her. "Chi, you can tell me if there's anything." He couldn't give her marriage, but he could give her everything else. She understood his feelings. Her heart was a little confused, but something was coming out. She stared at him in a daze, but in her heart, she was thinking. "Tang Yu, there's still one thing that you can't change for me, and that's my birth." The lights were switched off again, and he hugged her. Her temperature had returned to normal, just like a heating pad. Hugging a small one in his arms gave him an indescribable sense of satisfaction. Tang Yu didn't have the chance to own a doll when he was young, but seeing how Tang Xian loved to hug it to sleep, he guessed that this was the feeling. In his arms, Pei Chi-Chi's little hand slipped into his loosened collar. She felt a little restless. Tang Yu grabbed her hand and said in a hoarse voice, "Chi-Chi." Pei Chi-Chi broke free from his hand. Not only did she not stop, she even buried her little face in it. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at the little person in his arms. She was lying in his arms with her black hair draped over her fair shoulders. She had a wild beauty. Tang Yu felt like his whole body was on fire, and he had no way to release it. His large palms slid through her hair, and he still retained a trace of rationality. Chi-Chi. His voice was unbelievably hoarse. She was still sick, and he couldn't do this to her. However, Pei Chi-Chi looked up, and then her little face moved downwards. With a loud bang, all of Tang Yu's defenses collapsed. The only rational thing left was, he wanted her. He suddenly turned around and pressed her down. Her hand was raised high, and his long slender fingers slowly intertwined with hers. Their bodies were firm and firm. Tang Yu exhaled with difficulty. "I'll hurt you." Pei Chi-Chi closed her eyes and kissed him. Chapter 79. Even though he knew that she had something on her mind, and even though he knew that it wasn't a good time, he still couldn't take it when such a delicate little person threw herself into his arms and begged him to love her. Tang Yu was just an ordinary man, and he couldn't resist such temptation. He gave in to the desire in his heart, but because of her body, he only dared to do it gently twice. When he was done, he turned to the side and pulled her little body into his arms. After a while, he looked down at Pei Chi-Chi in his arms. She looked as if she had just been fished out of the water. The sweat on her forehead was stuck to her little face, and her body was also covered in a thin layer of sweat, which was a little sticky. Tang Yu reached out to brush her hair aside and moved closer. At this moment, her whole body was fragrant and soft. He kissed her on the lips and said hoarsely, "Go take a shower." She moaned weakly and opened her eyes to look at him for a while. Then, she closed her eyes weakly and replied softly, It was already 3:00 when Tang Yu carried her back to bed after the shower. Even he was a little exhausted, and he fell into a deep sleep while hugging Pei Chi-Chi. The next morning, it was expected that they would sleep late. When Pei Chi-Chi opened her eyes, she saw Tang Yu leaning against the headboard in his bathrobe. He was talking to Xiao Ran on the phone. He lowered his head to see that Pei Chi-Chi had woken up. He smiled faintly and said a few words before hanging up. "You're awake." Pei Chi-Chi was still looking at him. She didn't want to move at all because her body felt as if it had been dismantled. Her whole body was aching. Tang Yu reached out and placed his hand on her forehead. He said calmly, "You're not having a fever anymore, but you still have to take the medicine twice." As he said that, he lifted the blanket and was about to get out of bed. Pei Chi-Chi's little hand grabbed the corner of his shirt. Tang Yu was a little surprised. He turned to look at her and smiled. "I helped you apply for leave from school." "No." Pei Chi-Chi's voice was unbelievably hoarse. She didn't know why she grabbed him, but she just felt that she wanted someone to accompany her at this moment. Even if it was Tang Yu, even if he wanted her body. Tang Yu sighed and went back to lying down. Pei Chi-Chi proactively placed her little face on his waist. His heart softened a little. He reached out to stroke her black hair and smiled. "What's wrong?" Pei Chi-Chi shook her head and just lay on him. Tang Yu patted her. "I'll go get the medicine. Be good." However, it was rare for her to be disobedient. Her little hands hugged him instead. But very quickly, she felt that his body was quietly changing. Regarding this, Tang Yu was also a little embarrassed. At this moment, when she was so dependent on him, he went berserk. He was a little annoyed, but he couldn't bear to be fierce with her. He just pulled her away from his body and went outside to pour some water and bring the medicine back. Pei Chi-Chi didn't want to be unreasonable anymore. She sat up and took the medicine. Tang Yu took the cup. "Have breakfast and sleep for a while." It was only 9:00. He had only slept for 6 hours. Pei Chi-Chi looked up at him and asked in a daze, "Aren't you going to the office?" Tang Yu said very naturally, "Oh, I'm a little tired. I'll go in the afternoon." Pei Chi-Chi remembered what happened last night. Her face was a little hot, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Tang Yu came over and patted her. Go wash up and have breakfast. Pei Chi lifted the blanket and got out of bed. She felt dizzy and sat back down. Chapter 80. Tang Yu reached out to carry her. Pei Chi exclaimed and hugged his neck. She lowered her head and could see his handsome face. There was a light green stubble on his smooth chin, which made him look very sexy. Moving up, there were thin lips with a beautiful shape. He looked especially handsome in the morning light. Pei Chi's heart raced. She lowered her eyes and did not dare to look at him again. Tang Yu carried her to the washroom and put her down. I'll wait for you outside. Her face heated up and she replied softly, Tang Yu was a man who valued his privacy, so he gave her some space and stood outside for a while. Pei Chi turned on the cold water and splashed it on her face. Only then did she feel better. She looked up at herself in the mirror, but her face overlapped with Zhao Ke's. They had the same face. Pei Chi's expression became pained and her eyes were filled with hurt. She splashed cold water on her face like crazy. She would rather not have such a face. She would rather not know that she had a mother named Zhao Ke. Tang Yu leaned against the door silently. His brows were slightly furrowed as he looked at Pei Chi's hysterical look. She looked up and saw Tang Yu in the mirror. Her face was covered in cold water as she stared at him. She looked extremely pathetic. After a long time, Pei Chi's voice sounded a little absent-minded. Tang Yu, we shouldn't be together. He stood there without much of an expression on his face. Pei Chi stared at him in the mirror. She stubbornly stared at him until her body slowly collapsed. The heavy rain caused Pei Chi to get pneumonia and stay in the hospital for half a month. After her condition stabilized, Tang Yu hired an auntie to take care of her. The auntie took good care of her, and he would occasionally visit her. Pei Chi did not dare to tell Pei Mingyi as she was afraid that he would be worried. She was even more afraid that he would find out about her relationship with Tang Yu. The last time she and Tang Yu appeared in the newspaper, Zhou Meilin had purposely stopped Pei Mingyi from knowing. On Friday, the fourth day in the hospital, Chen Xinjie called. Pei Chi looked down at the name on the phone and was stunned for a while before picking it up. Xinjie. Chen Xinjie sounded a little anxious. Chi, you haven't come to school for a few days. I heard from the teacher that you're on sick leave, yes. Pei Chi smiled. I'll be going to class in a few days. Chen Xinjie paused for a moment, probably because her attitude wasn't too warm. Then she asked carefully, Chi, can I come over to see you? Pei Chi didn't reply immediately. Chi, what's wrong? Aren't we best friends? Chen Xinjie sounded a little disappointed. Pei Chi lowered her eyes. Of course we are. Chen Xinjie smiled and returned to her usual carefree self. Then I'll come over later. She hung up before Pei Chi could say anything. Putting down the phone, Pei Chi got off the bed and walked to the French windows. From here, the view was very good. She could see half of B City. The hospital's VIP rooms were fully equipped. Staying here was no different from staying in Xia City. Come to think of it, Tang Yu was really, really good to her. So good that she couldn't repay him. Pei Chi stood there quietly without much expression on her face. Chapter 81. Auntie Li was in her 50s and had a daughter abroad. She was a nice person. She helped Pei Chi back to the bed and scolded her as she walked. Look at your face. It's still yellow. You don't know how to rest. If Mr. Tang finds out, you'll have to get your butt pumped. Auntie Li only knew that Tang Yu was Pei Chi's boyfriend. She was scaring her with a straight face, but she was also full of love. Pei Chi smiled and lay back down with Auntie Lee's help. She closed her eyes and said softly, "Auntie Lee, I just want to stand for a while." Auntie Lee tucked her in and said in a gentle voice, "Mr. Tang told me not to get out of bed for a few days. You can wait until the doctor says it's okay." Then, she smiled mysteriously. "Mr. Tang loves you so much. He's handsome and rich. It's hard to find a man like him. You have to take advantage of him." Naturally, Pei Chi wouldn't say much. She just lifted the corner of her lips. Auntie Lee sat by the bed and peeled a pear for her. Mr. Tang called and said he'll come over tonight. Pei Chi was stunned. He came over twice during the 4 days she was in the hospital. Tonight was the 3rd time. Actually, he bought her to warm his bed. He didn't have to be so concerned about her when she was sick. Pei Chi didn't say anything. Auntie Lee pinched her gently and complained, "Why can't you be more attentive?" Pei Chi said, "Oh." Auntie Lee smiled. "That's right. Mr. Tang is a good partner." As they were talking, the door opened and Xinjie stood at the door. When Pei Chi looked over, she stuck out her tongue and said, "Chi, this ward is bigger than my house." Pei Chi smiled faintly. "School is over." Xinjie ran in and sat by the bed. She grabbed Pei Chi's hand and said, "Chi, how are you?" Pei Chi sat up and said, "I'm fine. It's acute pneumonia." "Is it serious? Is it contagious?" Xinjie covered her mouth and asked softly. With a smile in her eyes, Pei Chi leaned over to Xinjie and said slowly, "The doctor said it's contagious." Xinjie's eyes widened in fear. "I lied to you." Pei Chi leaned back and laughed. Although her face was still pale, the mischievous look on her face made it more lively. Xinjie covered her chest and let out a long sigh. "Chi, you're so bad." Pei Chi smiled, but there was no trace of a smile in her eyes. "Xanjie, how I wish that you weren't the one who betrayed me." Auntie Lee thought that the two girls had a good relationship. She stood up with a smile and said, "You guys talk." Seeing that Pei Chi was happy, she was also happy in her heart. She was a little girl, so it was better to be lively. Xinjie brought Pei Chi her class notes, as well as a piece of shocking news. Pei Huan was pregnant. Pei Chi was stunned. "She's pregnant after just one time. Chi, is there any justice in this world? Moreover, she didn't have a miscarriage after being beaten up by you." Xinjie's face was full of indignation. She stared at Pei Chi's face and said, "I feel that Pei Huan's child is a little strange." Pei Chi interrupted her. "She and Lin Jinrong are engaged. Don't say such things in the future." Chi, I'm feeling indignant for you." Lin Jinrong. Xinjie sounded agitated. Chapter 82. Pei Chi's heart skipped a beat, and Xinjie shut up in time. She moved her lips and coughed softly. "Chi, I'll go back first." She picked up her backpack, nodded at Tang Yu, and didn't leave. Auntie Lee was perceptive. She smiled when she saw Tang Yu coming over. "Mr. Tang is here. I'll go back first." Tang Yu walked with her to the door. He seemed to say something before Auntie Lee left. Pei Chi felt uneasy. She didn't know how much Tang Yu had heard. Tang Yu closed the door, walked over and sat by her bed. He placed his hand on her forehead. "Are you feeling better today?" He paused. "I heard from Auntie Lee that you got out of bed." His voice was a little questioning. Pei Chi felt relieved and said, "I've been lying down for a long time. I feel dizzy." He chuckled. "You can wait for me to carry you down." As he said that, he ruffled her hair, which also messed up her heart. Just when she was a little confused, Tang Yu said calmly, "Just now, you mentioned Jinrong. What's wrong with him?" Pei Chi looked up at him and said slowly, "Pei Huan is pregnant." Tang Yu frowned slightly and stared at her for a long time. She didn't know what he was thinking and felt a little uneasy. All of a sudden, his large palm was placed on her waist. Pei Chi felt uneasy and moved slightly. His voice was a little low. "Do you want to get pregnant?" Her eyes suddenly widened as she stared at him in disbelief. Tang Yu smiled gently. With her young body, if he wanted to get her pregnant, it wouldn't take a few months. He didn't reject a child between him and Pei Chi, but he wouldn't force her to give birth to a child for him. She was obviously scared out of her wits. After a long time, she asked softly, "What if I accidentally get pregnant?" He had sex with her frequently. Although he had always taken precautions, there were always accidents when it came to this kind of thing. Pei Chi had never thought about it before. Now that he mentioned it, she could not help but wonder. She did not want her child to be like her one day. No one wanted it. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at her dazed face. She must have been frightened. His slender and good-looking fingers were still moving slowly around her waist. Pei Chi's little hand grabbed his. Tang Yu. She rarely called him that, and she had never offended him in such a way. She treated him almost as an equal. Tang Yu was also in a daze. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, one hand pressing down on her fluffy little head. "If you're pregnant, give birth." She was stunned. She wanted to raise her head to look at him, but he pressed her down and didn't let her move. Then he said slowly, "Pei Chi, we'll get married then." Pei Chi was completely stunned. His hands pressed her even tighter, until her whole body was buried in his arms. His body was very warm. Pei Chi's little hand hesitated, but finally hugged his body. He lowered his head to find her little mouth and kissed her. Then he pried open her mouth and tangled with her. "Don't." Her voice was crushed by him and swallowed up by him. It was contagious. She didn't have the chance to say the last 3 words. He kissed her again and again. Just now, Tang Yu made a decision. Chapter 83. However, he did not say it out loud as he did not want to scare her. After this kiss, something seemed to have changed. Pei Chi's legs were still weak, but she moved from the bed to his lap. He was really not afraid of infecting her, so he kept hugging her, even when he was reading the documents. "I'm tired." Pei Chi could not help but protest. She was a patient, not a study companion. Tang Yu lowered his head and looked at her. He smiled and let go of her body. "I'll cook some porridge for you." Pei Chi looked at his back view and felt a little uneasy. "Tang Yu, you don't have to be so nice to me." He did not turn back but went to the kitchen. From that day on, Tang Yu spent the night in the ward, and sometimes he would even stay in the hospital during the day. Meng Qingqing could not help but complain, "Do you have to be like this? She's just a little girl. I don't think she has any tricks that can make you dizzy, right?" Tang Yu looked down at the documents and replied calmly, "I don't want her to know those things." When he said this, he paused for a moment, and his heart skipped a beat. He had always been the one serving her in the bed. Even the last time she took the initiative when she was sick, he was also the one who served her. "What are you thinking about?" Meng Qingqing sighed. "It's not like you haven't seen women before. Look at how precious you are now." He did not care so much about her in the beginning. Tang Yu looked up at him. "But the only one I've done it with is Pei Chi." Meng Qingqing understood. He blinked his eyes. "Well, don't you want to try something else? Maybe it will work." In the past, Tang Yu could not touch women. But now that he could touch Pei Chi, maybe others could touch her too. When he said that, Tang Yu just glanced at him. Meng Qingqing knew in his heart that Tang Yu was not interested. Pei Qiqi is beautiful, but she probably doesn't have much experience in that area. Meng Qingqing couldn't understand why Tang Yu would choose Pei Qiqi with his qualities. In this regard, Tang Yu did not explain anything. He had never liked to confess his own affairs. He tidied up the documents on the table. Meng Qingqing sighed slightly. Going back to serve Pei Qiqi again. Business trip. Special Assistant Meng, did you forget about going to H City? Tang Yu said indifferently. Meng Qingqing almost forgot. He jumped off the table and said, I really forgot. Tang Yu snorted, picked up his briefcase and walked out. Xiao Ran immediately followed him. President, the private plane is waiting. When Tang Yu sat on the private plane, he took out his mobile phone and dialed Pei Qiqi's number. I'm going on a business trip for 3 days. Aunt Li will come to cook at home. Pei Qiqi had been discharged from the hospital. At this time, she was sitting on the bed with her long hair draped over her shoulders. She was only wearing pajamas. She hummed. Tang Yu was silent for a while before he smiled softly. Be obedient. He said these 2 words very softly, but it tugged at her heartstrings. Pei Qiqi's face was a little hot. She couldn't say anything. She could only wait for him to hang up the phone first. Tang Yu stopped teasing her and hung up the phone. In fact, he was really busy these days. But in order to take care of Pei Qiqi, he compressed his itinerary. He didn't need a direct flight to H City, but now. He shook his head and smiled. On the other side, Pei Qiqi hung up the phone. Aunt Li came over with a stewed pear. Is it Mr. Tang? Pei Qiqi hummed. Chapter 84. But Mr. Tang was really nice to Pei Qiqi, and maybe they would get married in the future. Here, have a pear. It clears the lungs. Auntie Li put it in front of her. Pei Qiqi smiled and ate it in small bites. I'm taking a nap. Mr. Tang told me to. Auntie Li treated Tang Yu's words as an imperial edict. Pei Qiqi lay down and buried her face in the quilt. She said in a muffled voice, I'm going to sleep. Aren't you afraid that Mr. Tang will feel bad for you? Auntie Li loosened the quilt for Pei Qiqi and went out to do her own things. After the door closed, Pei Qiqi's little face appeared. She looked at the door and touched the place where Auntie Li touched. It was still warm. She looked at it in a daze and lay back down. When she fell asleep, she dreamed of Zhao Ke's beautiful face again, holding a check and asking her to leave Tang Yu. Mom, Mom, Pei Qiqi broke out in a cold sweat and felt hot all over. When a hand touched her forehead, she threw herself into that person's arms without hesitation. Auntie Li was stunned at first, but after a while, she hugged the girl in her arms lovingly. She must be having a nightmare. Her little body trembled in her arms, and it was indescribably adorable. Mom! Pei Qiqi still called out softly, and big tears slowly fell from the corners of her eyes. Only at this time could she cry freely. Auntie Li patted her little shoulder and comforted her. Pei Qiqi only calmed down after a long time. Auntie Li didn't ask anything, but she felt pity for such a beautiful girl. Fortunately, Mr. Tang loved her, but no matter how much he loved her, he couldn't replace her biological mother. Mr. Tang can replace her biological father. Laughed shamelessly. Pei Qiqi went to take a bath and felt much better when she came out. The next day, Auntie Li went back. Pei Qiqi sat on the sofa by the window and stared outside in a daze. Suddenly, she got up, changed her clothes, grabbed her bag, and walked out. They hailed a taxi and arrived at a high-class residential area with a nice name, Yanhui. In front of the European-style villa, there was a white goddess statue in the middle of the huge lawn, surrounded by little angels, and behind her was a fountain. Pei Chi saw Zhao Ku and a girl about 15 or 16 years old. The girl was very good-looking. She had a princess hairstyle and wore a pure thunder princess dress. In front of her was an easel. She was painting an oil painting with Zhao Ku by her side. At this moment, Zhao Ku's gaze was very gentle. Her fingers tapped on the oil painting and occasionally looked at the girl. Her expression was very different from the last time she saw her. Pei Chi stood there, staring blankly, feeling numb all over. It turned out that her mother was also gentle and loving. Zhao Ku looked up and saw Pei Chi. Her gaze immediately sharpened, and then she lowered her head and said something to the girl. The girl looked up at Pei Chi with a puzzled expression, but she still walked into the villa. Zhao Ku walked out and went straight to the point. "Did you change your mind?" Pei Chi didn't say anything, but just looked at her. Zhao Ku was a little annoyed. Pei Chi's gaze made her feel very uncomfortable. Chapter 85. At this moment, this bastard actually appeared by Tang Yu's side. Even if it was just for fun, she wouldn't allow it. Zhao Ku didn't panic like before. She turned her body and looked at the mansion behind her. Her gaze then landed on Pei Chi's little face. She said coldly, "You've seen it for yourself. Without you, Tang Axian and I are living a good life. I don't want to lose everything. Pei Chi, please don't destroy my happiness." Pei Chi subconsciously repeated her words. Happiness, so her other daughter was called Tang Axian. Tang Axian, who was like a princess. And her surname was Pei. Pei Chi chuckled. "You've never thought of me, have you?" Her face was filled with longing. She had never had a mother. She had only seen Pei Huan being lovingly held in Zhou Meilin's arms, while Pei Huan had called her a bitch. Pei Chi remembered that when she was young, she didn't really understand what it meant to be a little bitch. She didn't even know that she wasn't Zhou Meilin's biological daughter. She just thought that if she did better, Auntie Zhou would like her. Would she kiss her like how she did to Pei Huan? It wasn't until she understood why Pei Huan called Zhou Meilin Mom, and she called her Auntie, that she knew that Zhou Meilin would never kiss her. Zhao Ku's heart skipped a beat when she saw the expression on Pei Chi's face. It wasn't that she didn't feel Pei Chi's emotions, but how could she be so easily soft-hearted? Doing that with Pei Mingyi while she was pregnant with Pei Chi was the greatest humiliation of her life. Zhao Ku's face was cold. No. Pei Chi paused for a moment. Then she took a step back and laughed at herself. I thought so too. She turned around and slowly walked back in the direction she came from. Zhao Ku saw that she was about to leave. She took a step forward and grabbed Pei Chi's slender wrist tightly. Leave Tang Yu. Pei Chi looked up at Zhao Ku's beautiful face. At this moment, it was a little distorted from anxiety. How could this be a mother's face? How could she yearn for warmth from her body? She shook Zhao Ku off forcefully and sneered, Madam Zhao, don't worry. I won't tell anyone that you're my mother, because that would be a humiliation to me. Zhao Ku was stunned for a moment. Pei Chi had already broken free. Pei Chi walked very quickly, and Zhao Ku just stood there. She stared at the beautiful back view, her heart palpitating. If, when she was pregnant with Chi, that person could look at her more and comfort her gently, then perhaps she would also love this child. But no, that person didn't want her child. Time and time again, he didn't want her child. Zhao Ku thought of Tang Axian. Tang Axian's illness. For a moment, she wanted to keep Pei Chi. Perhaps Pei Chi's bone marrow would be compatible with Tang Axian's. Perhaps Tang Axian's illness would be cured, but it was only for a moment. She changed her mind. No, she couldn't take the risk. She couldn't let others find out about her relationship with Pei Chi. She couldn't let Ziyuan find out about Tang Xan's parentage. Once she was found out, she would have nothing left. At that moment, wealth won over family. Zhao Ku had once abandoned Pei Chi. Now, to a certain extent, she had also abandoned Tang Xan. Chapter 86. Zhao Ku snapped out of her daze and stared at Tang Xan for a long while. Tang Xan was startled and waved her hand in front of Zhao Ku. Mom. Zhao Ku snapped out of her daze and said calmly, "It's your brother's, mistress." Tang Xan was still young, but she understood what it meant to be a mistress. Her mother used to be her father's mistress, but my brother isn't married yet. She should be his girlfriend. Tang Xan bit her lower lip and asked in confusion. This stung Zhao Ku's heart. She used to be the most beautiful woman in B City, but she didn't come from a good family, so she could only be a mistress, but the man she had loved had always been that one. That person was so illustrious, but he had never paid attention to her. Don't ask, kid. Don't tell your father about this, lest he gets upset, okay? Zhao Ku instructed. Tang Xan nodded obediently and went back to her painting. Zhao Ku looked at her beautiful profile, and was a little stunned. Pei Chi looked more like her, but Tang Xan looked like that man. Zhao Ku's eyes flashed with pain. The past was like a huge wave crashing into her. Pei Chi walked home for more than 2 hours. Auntie Li was so worried that she went crazy. When she saw Pei Chi, she scolded, "You didn't even bring your phone. You went out for so long. You must have worried me to death." Pei Chi looked at Auntie Li's fierce face in a daze. She was her biological mother. Why didn't any strangers care about her? They didn't even ask her how she was all these years. Auntie Li coughed lightly. "All right, I'll forgive you this time, but don't do this again." Pei Chi reached out and hugged her. "Auntie Li, can I call you mommy?" Auntie Li was stunned. She reached out and caressed Pei Chi in her arms. "You can call me whatever you want." Pei Chi grabbed Auntie Li's arm with both hands and smiled. "I'll make chicken noodles for you." Tang Yu loves it. She ran into the kitchen happily, and Auntie Li watched from behind. Her heart ached. He felt that it was not easy for this little girl. It was already 3 days after Tang Yu returned. Pei Chi was watching TV with Auntie Li. She had already gone to class during the day. The door opened, and the chauffeur brought Tang Yu's luggage up and left. Tang Yu slowly closed the door, took off his coat and threw it aside. Pei Chi stared at him in a daze. She had already forgotten that today was the day he came back. Auntie Li had good eyesight. She stood up and said with a smile, "Mr. Tang, you haven't eaten yet, right? I'll go get some. Chi-Chi's chicken noodles are really good." Chi-Chi did it. Tang Yu unbuttoned his shirt and changed his shoes. He looked at Pei Chi. Her heart was beating a little fast, and she just stared at him in a daze. Auntie Li smiled and went to the kitchen. Tang Yu walked over and sat on the sofa armrest beside her. He leaned over and kissed her little mouth. His voice was deep and husky. "I thought you would only make it for me." As he said that, he patted her little p*nis as if he was punishing her. Pei Chi almost jumped up. Auntie Li heated up the noodles and removed her apron. "I'll go back first then." Chapter 87. Don't send me off. Spend more time with Mr. Tang. He's really nice to you. Auntie Li added. At her age, she could clearly see that Pei Chi was with Tang Yu. Even if they didn't get married in the end, there would be no problems with their lives in the future. Pei Chi nodded and closed the door after Auntie Li entered the elevator. As soon as she turned around, Tang Yu said, "Come here." Pei Chi was stunned, but she still walked to him obediently. Her slender waist was held by his large palm, and her entire body was sitting on his lap. Tang Yu put down the chopsticks in his hand. In fact, he hadn't started eating yet. Held by him like this, Pei Chi did not dare to move, nor did she dare to look at him. Her head hung low. Chi. He lifted her chin and forced her to look up. Pei Chi looked up. Her eyes were misty, and when she saw the jade gaze in his eyes, she hurriedly lowered her eyes. He chuckled and let her go. He patted her and said in a hoarse voice, "Go fill the bath." She said, "Oh," and ran away quickly. While filling the bath, she helped him pack his luggage. However, she saw a delicate box at the bottom of the suitcase. She was a little stunned. "It's for you. Open it and see." She didn't know when, but he leaned against the dressing room door and said lightly. Pei Chi looked up at him and opened the box. There was a delicate necklace inside. It was a very retro style with complicated golden lines around it. There was a rich jade in the middle, which looked very valuable. Tang Yu lifted her hair and put the necklace on for her. He looked at it in the mirror and smiled. "It suits you very well." Jadeite wasn't actually suitable for young girls, but it looked surprisingly good on Pei Chi's little neck. Pei Chi gently stroked the necklace with his fingers. He had a feeling that this necklace wasn't something he had bought on the spot. Of course, he wouldn't tell her that he had gotten it from his grandfather, Lin Yun's father, when he went to H City. This was something that his grandmother had treasured for a long time. Before she left, she told him that if he ever had the idea of starting a family, he should give this necklace to the girl so that she wouldn't be able to run away. Actually, Tang Yu had a better idea, which was to get Pei Chi pregnant. However, she was still too young. She was only 20 years old, so it was not suitable for her to have a child. Letting go of her hair, he leaned over and kissed her soft neck. His voice was a little hoarse. "Shower together." Pei Chi's face was slightly red, but she didn't move. Tang Yu picked her up and walked straight to the bathroom. Maybe it was because she had been sick for a long time, or maybe it was because he hadn't seen her for 3 days, so he couldn't control himself in the bathroom. Half coaxing and half forcing, he succeeded. Pei Chi hugged his neck and begged him in a broken voice, "Go in." She couldn't finish the word room. He bit her little ear and smiled wickedly. "Baby, I'm here." She balled her hand into a fist and punched him hard on the back. Tang Yu chuckled and moved closer to her ear. His hot breath blew on her little ear. "Either here or in the bedroom. You're on top." Chapter 88. Pei Chi couldn't stand it, but she didn't want to do it so blatantly. Actually, he hadn't stopped all this while and was torturing her. She had no choice. It was useless to beg him. Finally, she pleaded softly, "Go to the room." He got what he wanted and carried her to the room. Just as he was about to dote on her, the doorbell rang. Tang Yu cursed under his breath. His body tensed up. He didn't care about anything else, but the doorbell was still ringing relentlessly. She pushed his shoulders with her soft hands and said in a broken voice, "Someone's here." He lowered his head and leaned against her neck, saying passionately, "Don't worry." At this moment, she was so fragrant and soft. He was willing to die on top of her. Why would he think about it? "Tang Yu." She patted him with her little hands. She couldn't bear to do it anymore. He lowered his head and looked at the beautiful face in his arms. He heaved a sigh of relief and finally got up to leave her. He casually grabbed a bathrobe and put it on. Before he walked out, he turned back and said, "Don't go out yet." Pei Chi was resting with her eyes closed. Her little face was a little flushed and her eyelids were pink. She looked weak and weak. She grunted when she heard him. Tang Yu looked at her silently for a while before walking to the door to open it. The person who came was unexpected. It was Lin Jinrong. Jinrong. Tang Yu opened the door slowly. At the same time, he could smell the faint smell of alcohol on Lin Jinrong. He frowned. You drank. Lin Jinrong was wearing jeans and a white shirt with his jacket over his shoulders. He smiled faintly and walked in. Yeah, I drank a little. Brother Tang Yu, you slept. His gaze fell on Tang Yu. As a man, he could acutely feel the scent of love jade on Tang Yu. The jade in his eyes had not completely faded. This was different from the Tang Yu he knew. Brother Tang Yu was usually serious and dignified. He had never seen him so, like a normal man. And the girl who turned him into a normal man was none other than Pei Chi-Chi. Lin Jinrong watched for a long time, but Tang Yu had already closed the door. He walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water for Lin Jinrong. They sat on the sofa together. I heard that Pei Huan is pregnant. The corners of Lin Jinrong's lips twitched forcefully. He lowered his head to look at the water in the cup and looked up. Can you have a drink with me? He knew that Pei Chi-Chi was in the bedroom. It was possible that she was under Tang Yu's body just now. They were interrupted by him. Lin Jinrong did not know why he came here. Perhaps he was unwilling, or perhaps he wanted him to give up. Tang Yu looked at Lin Jinrong indifferently. After a long time, he smiled and said, "Of course." He stood up and went to the bar counter to open a bottle of aged red wine. He poured 2 glasses, but before he could bring them over, Lin Jinrong walked over. Let's drink here. Lin Jinrong took out a pack of cigarettes from his pocket and placed it on the bar counter. He lit it up skillfully and looked at Tang Yu. Do you want one? Tang Yu smiled faintly. No need. He looked sideways at the bedroom door. It was tightly shut. He turned back and said, Chi-Chi had pneumonia a few days ago. I don't smoke at home. Lin Jinrong was stunned. His fingers that were holding the cigarette did not move for a long time. He stared at Tang Yu's eyes. Tang Yu did not avoid his gaze. His expression was still indifferent. Chi-Chi is Pei Huan's sister. You've met her. Chapter 89. Lin Jinrong's voice was dry. You're together with her? Tang Yu smiled. Yes. Lin Jinrong didn't ask any more questions. He just took a deep puff of his cigarette, finished the wine in the glass, and poured himself a glass. Red wine couldn't get him drunk. The more he drank, the more sober he became. Tang Yu just took a sip and sat with him. Brother Tang Yu, you said before that you want to find a girl you like to fall in love with and find a suitable woman to marry. Now, is Pei Chi-Chi someone you like or someone suitable for you? Lin Jinrong looked straight into Tang Yu's eyes. Tang Yu glanced at the empty wine bottle. Jinrong had drunk a little too much. He leaned against the wine cabinet, his expression a little lazy. Jinrong, maybe I found a girl I like and is suitable for me. His expression was lazy, but his gaze was sharp. Lin Jinrong was stunned. He didn't expect Tang Yu to say that. The air seemed to freeze. In this silence, the door to the room opened. Pei Chi-Chi stood barefooted at the door in her pajamas and called out Tang Yu's name. Then her gaze froze when she saw Lin Jinrong. Lin Jinrong turned his head to look. His breathing seemed to have stopped. He just stared blankly at her in her pajamas. Was she going to lie with Tang Yu like this, naked? Go in and change your clothes. Tang Yu's voice was a little strict, with a tinge of tension. Pei Chi-Chi came back to her senses. Her gaze was still in a daze. She slowly responded with an "oh" and returned to the bedroom in slow motion. Her back was against the door, and her heart was beating rapidly. Although she knew that she would inevitably see Lin Jinrong from time to time when she was with Tang Yu, she didn't expect that Lin Jinrong would come here, and at night. She was a little embarrassed. Someone knocked on the door. She bounced up like a rabbit. Tang Yu's elegant voice came from the door. "Chi-Chi, change your clothes and come out for a nap." She stared at the door and did not move for a long time. He knocked on the door again and left. Pei Chi-Chi spent 10 minutes adjusting herself. She told herself that this kind of thing might happen more often in the future, and she had to get used to it. Lin Jinrong, Pei Huan, and Zhao Ku had put her relationship with Tang Yu in danger. She should have escaped. If Tang Yu found out about her feelings for Lin Jinrong and her relationship with Zhao Ku, she would be consigned to eternal damnation. At that time, would he still hold her in his arms to comfort her when she was afraid? Would he still coax her like an obedient child? She also admitted that she was selfish. She hid in the protective net woven by Tang Yu. When she went out, she didn't look at Lin Jinrong. She just smiled at Tang Yu. "I'm going downstairs." Lin Jinrong only glanced at her and didn't say anything. Tang Yu smiled faintly. "Chi-Chi's chicken noodles are good. Jinrong, have an extra bowl later." Lin Jinrong was stunned and couldn't help but look at Tang Yu. Everyone in the Lin family knew that Tang Yu's favorite was Lin Yun's chicken noodles. Now he liked Pei Chi-Chi's chicken noodles. Pei Chi-Chi paused for a moment and walked into the kitchen. Lin Jinrong still didn't stay to eat the noodles. He was afraid that he couldn't digest it. He picked up his jacket and patted it. "I'm leaving." Tang Yu didn't stay either. He leaned against the wall and said, "Drive slowly." Chapter 90. Lin Jinrong smiled and looked in the direction of the kitchen. At this moment, Pei Chi-Chi was wearing a pair of denim shorts. Her slender legs were fair and straight, and she was wearing a big t-shirt. Her hair was casually clipped up with a long clip, and her side profile looked very gentle under the light. She was like this, taking care of brother Tang Yu's business at home. Tang Yu did not move as he watched Lin Jinrong slowly close the door. Pei Chi-Chi came over with 2 bowls of noodles. Tang Yu was the only one left at the bar. "Jinrong is leaving first," he said lightly. "Oh," Pei Chi-Chi replied and quietly heaved a sigh of relief. She looked at the noodles on the table and asked, "What about this?" Tang Yu walked over. She thought that he wanted to eat the noodles, so she quietly pushed him to his usual seat. However, he stood and did not sit down. His long arm reached out and held her wrist. With a slight force, she fell into his arms. His kiss landed on her. It was a little urgent and a little fierce. "Tang Yu." She clenched her little fist and gently hammered his shoulder. However, she could not move him no matter how hard she tried. He led her to the wine cabinet and stumbled. When she realized his intention, she struggled slightly and said in a voice like a kitten, "Not here." Tang Yu paused for a moment. His gaze was fixed on her eyes. His dark eyes seemed to be gathering a storm, and she almost drowned in it. He lowered his head and kissed her again. He murmured hoarsely beside her lips, "Do it here once." He tyrannically bullied her in this place, where Jinrong had stood before. Pei Chi-Chi could not take it anymore. She cried softly, but she could not stop him. He did not let her off easily. After it was over, he carried her to the bedroom. Pei Chi-Chi lay in his arms. It seemed that after doing it once, he was not as impatient as before. He seemed to be taking his time. He cupped her little face and said in a low voice, "Pei Chi-Chi, do you like it when I do this to you?" She sat on his body helplessly and turned her face away. She trembled and refused to speak. He continued to provoke her even more, insisting that she tell him everything. "Tang Yu, she cried out in a small voice. She placed her small hand on his shoulder, not knowing what to do. Although she had done it with him before, she was still not used to the relationship between a man and a woman. Especially when that feeling came, she was extremely afraid. He tortured her with a heart of stone, and at last she wept softly and said, yes. Since she liked it, he wouldn't stand on ceremony. Do you like it? Her voice was broken, and she kept saying yes. Pei Chi-Chi, do you like me? She closed her eyes and murmured, I like it. Tang Yu suddenly pulled her into his arms. Pei Chi-Chi, since you like him, you can't change it. Remember, you said the word like to me. But she was in a daze, so how could she know about his dark thoughts? After a night of indulgence, Tang Yu was also a little exhausted. He was not in the mood to take a shower, so he fell asleep while hugging her. However, he woke up early in the morning. Today was Xing Yuan's shareholders' meeting, and he would be hosting it. Pei Chi-Chi was still asleep. He looked at her sleeping face as he put on his clothes. Perhaps because he was really fierce last night, there were still traces of tears at the corner of her eyes. Chapter 91. Tang Yu knew that he had lost control last night, and that it was because of Jinrong. He had always been successful since he was young. Other than Tang Ziyuan and Lin Yun's broken marriage, he had nothing to be envious of. But last night, he tasted jealousy. He was actually jealous of Jinrong. Perhaps Jinrong and Pei Chi-Chi didn't show it too much. She was always very restrained. But as a man, he could still sense it. After tying his tie, he half knelt in front of her. Her long eyelashes trembled unnaturally. Tang Yu reached out and touched her little ear. I'm going to work first. Pei Chi-Chi didn't move. He smiled lightly and his thin lips pressed against the soft flesh behind her ear. He gently bit it and murmured, there's still time. Do it once before you leave. She opened her eyes immediately and looked at him with a gaze that made his hair stand on end. I've applied for leave for you. Auntie Lee came over too. Heat up your breakfast later. He kissed her forehead and ruffled her hair. Pei Chi-Chi knew that she had been tricked and glared at him. This was the first time she had been so childish in front of him. Tang Yu's heart softened. The unhappiness from last night also dissipated a lot. He pinched her soft face and said, if you keep looking at me like that, I really won't let you off. Pei Chi-Chi pulled the blanket down to her eyes. Tang Yu only thought that it was a little funny. He kissed her. If you're tired in the afternoon, you don't have to go to the office. She shook her head. Her eyes were wide open. He finally kissed her eyelids. I'm leaving. His voice was a little hoarse. He knew that if he stayed any longer, he probably wouldn't be able to leave. When Tang Yu walked out of the door, he raised his hand to look at the time. It was already 9 o'clock. Usually, he would be in the office at this time. It was already 9:30 when he arrived at Xingyuan. He walked to his office with Xiao Ran following behind him. As they walked, he handed over the documents and explained them to him. Tang Yu walked to his desk and sat down. He threw his coat on the back of the chair and read the documents in his hands. His gaze landed on the last line and he frowned. Who suggested this? Xiao Ran's body bent a little. After seeing it, he said softly, it was Mr. Tang who suggested it. Tang Ziyuan. Although Tang Ziyuan had retired, he still retained 20% of Xingyuan's shares. Tang Yu had 40%, and Lin Yun had 10%. After Xiao Ran finished speaking, Tang Yu didn't say anything else. He glanced at the documents again, stood up, and walked towards the door. Xiao Ran immediately followed. In the conference room, Tang Ziyuan and Lin Yun were already there, along with a group of small shareholders. What attracted Tang Yu the most was Zhao Ku. Zhao Ku was sitting next to Tang Ziyuan. Tang Yu nodded at Lin Yun and sat down. This upset Tang Ziyuan. His son was treating him like nothing. Tang Ziyuan was angry and helpless, but Zhao Ku was even more upset. She had been married to Tang Yu for more than 10 years, and Tang Yu had never looked her in the eye. Originally, Tang Ziyuan didn't want to bring her here. It was Zhao Ku who insisted. She knew that old woman, Lin Yun, would come, and she had to watch over her. Of course, she knew that Tang Ziyuan couldn't forget his ex-wife. He would even call her Yun Yun in his dreams. Zhao Ku was disgusted. Chapter 92. After Tang Yu sat down, Xiao Ran distributed the documents and discussed the plan for the next half of the year. The minor shareholders were divided into several factions. Most of them supported Tang Yu, while some of them were Tang Ziyuan's old subordinates or Lin Yun's direct subordinates. When there were no objections, the atmosphere was good. However, once Lin Yun and Tang Ziyuan had different opinions, it became a little noisy. This was also a major feature of Xing Yuan's shareholders' meeting, which had been maintained for more than 10 years. The meeting lasted for nearly 2 hours in the morning. During the lunch break, Tang Yu invited Lin Yun to a restaurant outside. Tang Ziyuan stared blankly for a long time before sighing softly and leaving with Zhao Ku unhappily. Tang Yu chose a very elegant Chinese restaurant. Lin Yun held a delicate cup in her hand and carefully tasted the tea. After a while, she put down the tea and looked at Tang Yu. Last time, your father called me and questioned me about that girl. Actually, she didn't take it to heart. She more or less knew about Tang Yu's problem. Moreover, that day at Jinrong's engagement ceremony, Tang Yu didn't formally introduce Pei Qiqi to her. She thought it was nothing, but later on, Tang Yu's actions didn't express it in this way. Her son had never been a high-profile person. Even if he had a relationship with Shen Lian before, few people in the outside world knew about it. Tang Yu was holding the teapot to refill Lin Yun's water. When he heard this, his hand paused for a moment. After refilling the water, he put down the teapot in his hand and smiled faintly. Mom, I'll bring Qiqi to see you another day. Lin Yun had a plan. Although it wasn't very convenient, she still coughed softly and asked suggestively, "You guys are living together?" This was what Tang Ziyuan told her as soon as he came today. She was a little surprised, so she had to ask. Just then, the waiter served the dishes. Tang Yu very calmly responded with a as he placed the dishes for Lin Yun. Lin Yun knew that Tang Yu and Pei Qiqi had slept together. She breathed a sigh of relief and didn't ask any more. It was rare for her to have a meal with her son, so it was quiet and warm. However, the afternoon meeting wasn't so warm. Tang Ziyuan saw that Tang Yu wanted to end the meeting, so he said directly, "We haven't discussed my proposal to buy Pei's group yet." When he said this, he stared at Tang Yu's young face. Tang Yu had never given him any face in the company. Tang Ziyuan knew that Tang Yu hated him for abandoning Lin Yun, but at the time, he had no choice. If he didn't marry Zhao Ku would jump off a building. Tang Yu's gaze landed on Tang Ziyuan's face as he smiled lightly. "I don't think a conservative company like Pei Corporation is worth acquiring by Xingyuan. You of Tang Yu of Ziyuan and Zhao Yen, Zhao, Tang. Pei's group Yen, Pei's group Ziyuan. Zhao Yen. She was the one who suggested buying Pei's group to Tang Ziyuan. If they destroyed the Pei family, Pei Qiqi would never have the chance to enter the Tang family. Lin Yun's old man, Lin Yu, would never agree to it. Although Tang Yu was only taking care of Pei Qiqi, she was worried. She couldn't let Pei Qiqi have the chance to stand by her side. Chapter 93. Tang Ziyuan wanted to vomit blood. He naturally knew that Tang Yu had played a huge part in Pei Mingyi's revival. Moreover, Pei Mingyi had more or less received favors from Tang Yu later on. However, these were things that could not be said openly. Tang Ziyuan looked around and said slowly, "Since that's the case, we can only vote." Tang Yu didn't comment. Tang Ziyuan was the first to raise his hand. "I approve of the acquisition of the Pei Corporation." Then, a few other shareholders followed suit. Xiao Ku heaved a sigh of relief, but then Lin Yun said indifferently, "I don't approve." Tang Ziyuan looked over and Lin Yun repeated, "I agree with Tang Yu." Yun, this isn't the time to be impulsive." Tang Ziyuan subconsciously called out her nickname. Lin Yun was a little annoyed, but Xiao Ku was embarrassed. Her beautiful face was a little pale, and she hurriedly called out to Ziyuan. Tang Ziyuan came back to his senses and looked a little uncomfortable. He coughed lightly and corrected himself. "Director Lin, this concerns Xing Yuan's future." Lin Yun sneered. "I believe in Tang Yu's judgment." It wasn't easy for Tang Yu to sleep with a girl. How could he sleep with her now that the Pei Corporation was acquired? As a mother, she didn't care about anything else. All she cared about was that her son was happy. When Lin Yun was young, she also put her career first and neglected her family. It was only after she lost it that she realized that money wasn't that important. Tang Ziyuan was a little angry, but he understood what Lin Yun was thinking. But he didn't approve of this matter. It was fine if it was just for show, but if he really wanted to marry Pei Chichi, the Pei family status was far from enough. Moreover, Pei Chichi was only an illegitimate daughter. On this matter, he and Xiao Ku were on the same side. Tang Ziyuan slowly swept his gaze across the crowd, wanting to get more support. Actually, everyone knew that there were only benefits to acquiring the Pei Corporation. There were no disadvantages, perhaps because the benefits were too tempting. People raised their hands one after another. At this moment, the company's largest shareholder other than the Lin and Tang families, Xiao Yi, who was also the company's vice president, spoke up. "I object to the acquisition. The Pei family is about to form an alliance with the Lin family's Rongguang, and our Xing Yuan and Rongguang are still connected by the roots. Doing this will hurt our relationship with Rongguang." Tang Ziyuan was speechless. He had overlooked this point and couldn't help but look at Lin Yun. Lin Yun's face was expressionless, as if Xiao Yi's words didn't affect her at all. Xiao Yi's words also had weight in the company, so he got his support. In this way, Tang Ziyuan's proposal was somewhat insignificant. As a result, nothing was done. Tang Yu had a veto power, but he wouldn't use it easily. Otherwise, it would make him look arbitrary. As soon as Xiao Yi said this, Tang Yu took another look at him. Tang Yu remembered that Xiao Yi had proposed to acquire Pei Corporation in the previous meeting. At that time, Pei Mingyi's company was on its last breath. Xiao Yi's words made him look at him again. Tang Yu remembered that Xiao Yi had proposed to acquire the Pei Corporation in the previous meeting. At that time, Pei Mingyi's company was on its last breath. Xiao Yi also noticed Tang Yu's gaze. He smiled and didn't say anything. Most importantly, he was afraid that Lin Yun would misunderstand. His original intention was to get rid of Pei Mingyi, but he accidentally hurt his ex-wife's heart. Chapter 94. Tang Yu retracted his gaze and looked at Tang Ziyuan for a moment. He didn't look at Xiao Ku, just like before. Xiao Ku still wanted to say something, but Tang Ziyuan stopped her. "Let's go." In the elevator, Xiao Ku's expression was a little ugly. She couldn't help but say to Tang Ziyuan, "Ziyuan, are you going to watch Tang Yu be with that illegitimate daughter?" Tang Ziyuan was also annoyed. He closed his eyes and ignored Xiao Ku's words. Ziyuan. Zhao Ku hugged his arm and said with a hint of dissatisfaction. Tang Ziyuan opened his eyes and looked at Zhao Ku. He said slowly, "It's normal for men to play around. You don't have to be so nervous." Zhao Ku's voice was a little sharp. They're already living together. Tang Yu doesn't avoid the media. How could he be playing around? Tang Ziyuan looked at her deeply. His gaze was a little unreadable. Zhao Ku knew that she had said something wrong. She pursed her lips and said carefully, "I'm doing it for his own good. Tang Yu has his own mother." Tang Ziyuan said calmly. Zhao Ku's eyes immediately turned red. She turned her face to the side. "Tang Ziyuan, I know you can't forget Lin Yun. You couldn't help but call her Yun Yun just now. Why don't you just remarry her? I'll move out with Tang Xian. Tang Xian's health isn't good anyway. You won't like her." Tang Ziyuan's heart softened a little when she mentioned Tang Xian. Tang Xian was obedient and sensible, unlike Zhao Ku who was willful. Tang Ziyuan felt a little guilty towards his younger daughter. Tang Xian was born sick, probably to punish him for his philandering. It was a miracle that she was still alive. "Okay, I know what you're thinking." Tang Ziyuan comforted her. He thought that Zhao Ku just wanted to build a good relationship with Tang Yu. One day, even if Tang Xian wasn't around, she would still have a place. But he never thought that he would never be able to guess Zhao Ku's thoughts. Only then did Zhao Ku feel a little happier. She tugged at Tang Ziyuan and said, "I heard that the girl was transferred to the design department. Aren't you going to take a look?" Tang Ziyuan thought for a moment. Over the years, Tang Yu had hardly been close to women. He really wanted to meet a girl who could make Tang Yu make an exception. When the retired emperor was patrolling, everyone was naturally respectful. Only then did Zhao Ku feel that she was being respected. Like the mistress of Xingyuan, she held Tang Ziyuan's arm and patrolled the floors. Pei Chi arrived at the company before 3:00. She wasn't busy in the design department, and no one asked her to do anything. She was completely free, but she also knew that this was an extremely rare opportunity, so she tried her best not to disturb others while observing the work of the big shots. When Tang Ziyuan and Zhao Ku entered, the first person they saw was Pei Chi. Her beauty was the kind that could be seen at a glance in a crowd, just as eye-catching as Zhao Ku when she was young. Moreover, other than her beauty, Pei Chi also had a charm that Zhao Ku didn't have. Tang Ziyuan had to admit that his heart, which had stopped beating for any beauty, really skipped a beat when he saw Pei Chi. His eyes almost greedily stared at the side of Pei Chi's face. She was really a beautiful girl. It wasn't surprising that Tang Yu was tempted. Even if he was 10 years younger, he would probably get her without any hesitation. Chapter 95. Your name is Pei Chi, isn't it? Tang Ziyuan asked calmly. Pei Chi looked up and saw Tang Ziyuan and Zhao Ku standing by the door. Her face turned pale. In Tang Ziyuan's eyes, this girl was just feeling guilty. She didn't know that it was because of Zhao Ku. Pei Chi stared at Zhao Ku unconsciously. Zhao Ku was a little angry and her face was cold. After a long while, Tang Ziyuan coughed lightly. You're with Tang Yu, right? The moment she asked this question, everyone in the design department looked over. Although this was an open secret in Xingyuan, no one had said anything about it. This was because Pei Chi was a low-profile person and had never put on airs as Tang Yu's woman. She didn't look like a mistress either. After all, which mistress would want to be an intern? As for Zhao Ku, everyone in Xingyuan didn't like her. She was a mistress and yet she was acting all high and mighty. Wasn't she shameless? Pei Chi came back to her senses. She looked at Tang Ziyuan's face and found a touch of familiarity. Then she thought of Zhao Ku, who was next to her, and he should be Tang Yu's father. She nodded and didn't deny it. Tang Ziyuan sighed. She was such a beautiful girl and he didn't know what to do. At this moment, Zhao Ku raised her voice and said, "Manager Qin." Manager Qin immediately went up to her. "Mrs. Tang." Zhao Ku's face was stern. Since when did Xingyuan start using the back door? How can a student who hasn't even graduated work in the design department? Manager Chen was in a difficult position. This was the CEO's order, but Mrs. Tang was in such a state and he couldn't reject her. He muttered to himself. To Pei Chi-Chi, this was an embarrassing situation. But the only thing she could feel was that Zhao Ku was making things difficult for her. This woman had abandoned her and now she couldn't tolerate her. This was her mother, but she hated her more than a stranger. Pei Chi-Chi smiled lightly. "Mrs. Tang, what qualifications do you think are needed to work in Xingyuan?" Zhao Ku was taken aback by the question. Throughout her life, she had been around different men. She knew nothing about the workplace. Now that she was stumped, she couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed and angry. With a cold voice, he ordered, "Manager Qin, fire Pei Chi-Chi immediately." Manager Qin was put in a difficult position. How was he qualified? Just then, a deep voice came from the door. "Who is Mrs. Tang to Xingyuan? What right do you have to fire my employee?" Tang Yu came in, followed by Meng Qingqing. Meng Qingqing shrugged his shoulders and stood at the side to watch the show. Tang Yu against his little stepmother. Sigh, it seemed that they hadn't really clashed in the past decade or so. Was he going to start a war for Pei Chi-Chi this time? Zhao Ku felt a stab in her heart, as if she had been stabbed by a needle. Tang Yu had never even called her auntie. Calling her Mrs. Tang was even more humiliating. Zhao Ku's lips trembled as she said, "I'm married to your father." Tang Yu glanced at Tang Ziyuan and his eyes became even colder. "That's between you and him. Mrs. Tang, you have nothing to do with Xingyuan. How did you get into the shareholders' meeting?" He pointed the finger at Tang Ziyuan. Tang Ziyuan had wanted to say a few words for Zhao Ku so that Tang Yu would show some respect. But now that he was being scolded, he could only rub his nose and keep quiet. Chapter 96. Tang Yu pulled Pei Chi-Chi over and placed her in front of him. "I arranged for Pei Chi-Chi to stay in the company. If Mrs. Tang wants to fire her, does that mean you have to fire me as well?" Zhao Ku was stunned. Tang Yu's last sentence was very serious. She looked at him in a daze and subconsciously called out to Ziyuan. Tang Ziyuan sighed softly. "Zhao Ku, let's go." Although he still held 20% of the shares, he didn't hold a position in Xingyuan, so he didn't have any personal power. Zhao Ku was too anxious today. Zhao Ku looked at Pei Chi-Chi in Tang Yu's arms. Pei Chi-Chi's eyes were cold and clear as she looked into them. Zhao Ku's heart trembled. She murmured silently, "She's here to collect a debt, to collect a debt." Tang Ziyuan didn't hear her clearly, but Pei Chi-Chi could tell from the shape of her lips that her little face was pale. In the end, Tang Ziyuan pulled Zhao Ku away. Zhao Ku was in a daze the whole time. She kept thinking that the child was here to collect a debt, otherwise, why would she have a pair of eyes like that? When they got into the car, Tang Ziyuan turned to look at Zhao Ku and couldn't help but say, "You're too impatient." Zhao Ku sobered up a little. She looked at Tang Ziyuan and said in a low voice, "You also think that I shouldn't interfere with the company's affairs, right?" Tang Ziyuan looked at her for a long time and reached out to hold her hand. He then said slowly, "I know that you're not happy that I retired these few years. But Zhao Ku, Tang Yu is my only son. I've already let his mother down. I can't let him down anymore. I'm not a good father, but Xingyuan isn't decided by me alone. Zhao Ke suddenly pulled her hand back and smiled lightly. I know that you and Lin Yun fought for Xingyuan together. Of course, you won't hand it over to an outsider. She raised her head again and said unwillingly, Tang Ziyuan, all these years, you didn't let me have another child because you were afraid that it would threaten Tang Yu's position, right? Tang Ziyuan was speechless. He did not want to talk to her anymore. He did not want to have children because of Tang Xan. He hoped that Zhao Ke could spend more time with Tang Xan's health, but Zhao Ke didn't understand at all. Then, he thought of his ex-wife who didn't fight for anything. When he was with Lin Yun, it might be ordinary, but it was also comfortable. It wasn't that Tang Ziyuan hadn't regretted it all these years, but he had never shown it for Tang Xan's sake. Closing his eyes, Pei Qiqi's little face appeared in his mind. In the past, Zhao Ke was also as fresh and picturesque as she was now. On the other side, Pei Qiqi was still standing in the design department. Tang Yu looked down at her for a while and suddenly said, Pei Qiqi, come to my office. She raised her eyes and looked at him, not knowing what to do. Tang Yu had already walked to the door, but after a few steps, he suddenly turned back. The employees who were watching immediately lowered their heads and pretended to be very busy. I'm not watching the boss's show. Why aren't you leaving? His voice was a little deep and a little hoarse. Pei Qiqi bit her lower lip and followed him. When she walked to his side, Tang Yu reached out and hugged her shoulder in front of everyone. Chapter 97. Towards Pei Qiqi, at least, the CEO treasured her very much. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come here to save her and take her away. Pei Qiqi looked up. Her entire body's senses were focused on his shoulder. His large palm was warm as he gently grasped her shoulder and brought her outside. Everyone in the design department saw the CEO pull Pei Qiqi into his arms after they were out of the door. It was as if he was hugging his precious baby. How much love did he have to dote on her like this? Tang Yu lowered his head. His voice was a little faint, but it was also a little hoarse. Still unhappy. Pei Qiqi's heart was a little wet. She turned her face away slightly. No. The next second, she felt a kiss on her forehead. Tang Yu's voice rang out above her head. I've already kissed you. With that said, he stroked her hair. Pei Qiqi felt her heartbeat quicken. It was an indescribable feeling. She looked up, not realizing that she was still in his arms. After that, she was brought to his office. Tang Yu didn't say anything, nor did he explain his relationship with Zhao Ke. He just let her stay in his office. Occasionally, he would say a few words to her. Most of the time, he would ask her to help him pour a glass of water or carry some documents. Pei Qiqi stayed up until 5:00. Seeing that he still had no intention of getting off work, she walked over to his side. She tugged at his sleeve gently with her little hand. What's wrong? Tang Yu smiled at her actions in his heart, but he didn't show it on his face. This little fellow didn't even know how cute her actions were. Pei Qiqi opened her mouth. Her voice was a little hoarse. I want to go back first. If it were any other time, Tang Yu probably wouldn't agree to it. She could even eat and read here. But after what happened today, he thought that she probably needed some private space. And he wasn't the kind of man who would stare at his woman all the time. So he nodded. Be careful when you go back. After thinking for a while, he added, I'll be back at around 8. Make me some noodles. Pei Qiqi nodded, picked up her bag, and walked towards the door. She no longer needed to wear her uniform, nor did she need to change on the way. She wore a refreshing dress and tied her hair in a ponytail, looking very girlish. When she reached the door, Tang Yu suddenly called out to her. Chi-Chi. Pei Chi-Chi placed her finger on the doorknob and turned her head to look at him. Tang Yu adjusted his tie and left his seat to walk towards her. Stand still. She looked at him, thinking that he wanted to kiss her. After all, he really liked kissing her these days. However, he just reached out to touch her little head and shook his head. You're still too young. Pei Chi-Chi instinctively lowered her head to look at her chest. It's not small here, it's just right. His voice was a little hoarse, and she blushed. It was too hateful. Tang Yu smiled. I'll get the chauffeur to send you. Don't. She looked up at his smiling face and lowered her head in a fluster. Tang Yu's voice was deep. Be obedient. Pei Chi-Chi bit her lower lip. I don't want to be obedient. What are you talking about? He pulled her little body that was about to leave and smiled ambiguously. Even though he was smiling, he still had the authority of a superior. Pei Chi-Chi shrugged. Nothing. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.